Good morning. Good day, CSPC. Thanks for holding on for a couple minutes there. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties on the back end, but smoothing them out. But here we are, day 3, CSPC. I hope you're all enjoying the conference and soaking in all of the knowledge and brain power on offer this year. Like many of you, I am hopefully, cautiously looking forward to seeing you all in person next year. I'm Rachel Maxwell, and I'm the Executive Director at Evidence for Democracy, who is the host and organizer of this discussion today. And I'm absolutely thrilled you're joining us for this session, also known as Panel 286, also known as Closing the Transparency Gap, How Science, Society, and Policy Can Advance Evidence-Informed Decision-Making Together. So really taking a look at the relationship between transparency and evidence usage in public policy. If you're in the wrong session, don't leave. We're going to have a really great session here. This E4D has been thinking about this session for a long time, and we've been doing work on transparency now for coming up on a couple years. And while transparency is something that comes up in a variety of conversations, from open data and open science and access to information, today's discussion is really about narrowing in on how governments demonstrate the relationship between evidence that they use and the policy decisions that they make, and why that matters. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the land upon which Evidence for Democracy is located. And I know that many of you are tuning in from different communities and lands, so I do encourage you to take a moment to think about the history of the land that you're located on. Our office in Ottawa is located on the traditional unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So while we take a moment to acknowledge this, let's all recognize the history and continuation of colonialism on this land, and for all the settlers on the call to think about the benefits that we experience because of this history and how we can do our best to respect and stand in solidarity with those who were here first. I'm going to assume that you've probably already read the bios of the panelists today. And believe me, it's a true embarrassment of riches today. We have Tracy Brown, who I'm just so thrilled she's able to join us today. Tracy's from the UK-based organization Sense About Science, which champions sound science and evidence in public life. Ted Hsu, a physicist and scientist by training, politician by experience, who's a former federal MP and current MPP candidate in Ontario. Frédéric Bouchard is a professor and dean from the University of Montreal, whose Science and Society talk that aired in early 2020 has really gotten into my veins. So I encourage you all to look it up if you haven't listened to it. And of course, E4D's own Farah Quasar, who is leading our transparency work at the moment and is the Director of Research and Policy at E4D. So we did approach this panel a bit differently than assembling a group of experts. So while Tracy and Farah are doing this work in their organizations, we're bringing in Ted and Frédéric to bring in some different angles here. Just checking to see if the senator's joined. I don't think he has. My next move here was to introduce our moderator, who is still working out some of his technical difficulties, but I will briefly introduce him in the hopes that he's going to join us and will take over moderating. So Senator and Dr. Stan Kuchar is a leading psychiatrist and professor who has helped people manage their mental health. Dr. Kuchar studied history and political science before earning his medical degree from McMaster, and later joining the University of Toronto at Sunnybrook Hospital, where he transformed the adolescent psychiatry division into an innovative clinical and research facility. He's held appointments in the psychiatry department at Dalhousie University, and was Associate Dean for International Health and the Sun Life Financial Chair in Adolescent Mental Health. Dr. Kuchar has shared his training in policy development and expertise with people and organizations in over 20 countries. Of course, at E4D, when we see senators and parliamentarians out there advocating for using the best available science and evidence, it makes our science policy hearts very glad. So while he is not yet here, thank you to the senator for bringing his wealth of experience here today. I'm sure he's going to join us momentarily. So this would be the point that I would be passing it over to him. But rather than do that, I think I'm going to just immediately pass it over to Tracy Brown from Sense About Science to introduce herself, open this session, and talk about the work that Sense About Science has been leading on transparency in the UK. So does that sound good, Tracy?
Rachel, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. And I should start by saying how utterly delighted I am to be in this position, talking to you today as really the first country to carry through the work that we've done with transparency of evidence in the UK. Following that, the initiation of that work around 5-6 years ago, there was a lot of interest from around the world, which I'm delighted about. But you Canadian folk have got there first in terms of finding a way of adapting that for your country circumstances and your government setup. So it's really, really exciting for us, and I think testament to the dynamism that Evidence for Democracy has in being fleet of foot and looking at ways to improve the evidence base in policy making. Really, really delighted. So I'm going to tell you a tiny bit about the history of what do we mean by transparency of evidence. In the UK, this is now something that's in our Treasury Green Book, which is the sort of the guidebook for policy making that the government must abide by in order to get policies funded. That's a very new thing, and it comes about because of something that we stirred up. It happened around 5-6 years ago because many of you who've been sort of through various policy fashions will know that the What Works campaigns were really sort of taking off, and people were looking at, actually, we need good evidence base to look at what interventions work and how do we know they're working, and so on. And there were a whole number of initiatives that began to get up a bit of head of steam, civil service reforms and various other initiatives to improve and bridge the relationship between the academic world and data and policy making, for example. So the question began to be asked, well, what's all this leading to? How do we know if any of these initiatives are resulting in better use of evidence in government departments? And more to the point, how can the public make judgments about the relative strengths of the policies that are proposed, and so on? We, first of all, were asked by What Works advisor in the UK government to actually look at how we thought, well, it would be really clever. We'll compare departments on how they're using evidence. And that's a very good behaviour change mechanism. And as we started to look into it, we realised we had a really big prior problem, which is we couldn't compare that evidence because we couldn't see that evidence. We didn't know what the government had looked at. And why it had drawn the conclusions it had drawn. So we realised then that we had not just an issue to do with sort of understanding where evidence can be improved, where we could have better inputs. For example, if you're a researcher in elder care, whether or not there's a room for the latest systematic review in government policy, whether that's been taken into account or not, that kind of thing. But actually a much bigger issue. One is the democratic mandate, which is trying to get democratic buy-in. And I think the pandemic has really shown us the importance of that. If we felt that we were making an uphill argument about that 5 or 6 years ago, we certainly don't now. But also the historical memory of government. 5 years' time, how is it that the next incumbents actually know what was tried, why it was tried? How do different government departments understand each other and what they're trying to achieve with different policy interventions? How do regional and local parts of government level all the way down to the town understand what national, federal arrangements are? So we realized that's really quite a serious problem. So what we did is we devised a transparency of evidence framework. We consulted very widely on this, and we used our extensive relationships with different communities of people who are interested in government policy. What I mean by that is, for example, people who advocate for better work in homelessness or better work in alcohol and drug abuse, people who advocate for better community investment, and so on. We worked with them as motivated citizens to say, can you tell? So you're not a policy expert, but can you tell what the government is trying to do and why. And the four parts of this framework came to be diagnosis, that is, what is the nature and scale of the problem that government is seeking to address, proposal, what do we plan to do about it, implementation, how we plan to do that. And if you think about something like minimum pricing for alcohol, would that be by legislation or would it be by a voluntary agreement with retailers and so on? And then testing and evaluation, which is, can we tell whether this policy has worked, and how will we tell? In the case of consultations, which is often how policies are floated initially by government, we looked at whether or not we could see how that information coming out of that consultation, how that evidence was going to then be used in devising the policy. We then we published this as something called Show Your Workings with the Institute for Government in 2015, and built on from there to a spot check. We've run two major spot checks comparing government departments. We found that the crucial thing was to make sure we had good buy-in across particularly the analytics professions, and we brought them in to look at the methodology we proposed to use for our spot check. We then scored the spot checked policy. So we drew a sample. We had real trouble pulling together the list of policies that were passed by government, and there's perhaps a lot to discuss around that, but I'm sure Farah's been engaging with that for Evidence for Democracy. But we made sure you can't score in the middle too. We scored 0, 1, 2, 3, 3 being very good, explaining what the uncertainties in the evidence are, where the gaps are, and so on. So sort of an analytical relationship to the evidence being used. 0 clearly being that we can't tell what this is based on. And 1 would be the sort of likes of sort of hand waving in the direction of the report or commission or whatever that was the basis. 2 would be a really good solid explanation of the actual point in that evidence that was being drawn upon. For example, what the anticipated road use was going to be in a major city in 2030. So that's what we did. We found that by showing these scores, literally publishing these scores by department, immediately we got a huge level of engagement from departments. Some very grumpy, as you can imagine, and some very pleased, but all of them ultimately wanting to work with us. And it has led to some very high-level workshops with senior civil servants to look at how to improve those scores. And indeed, they did start to improve. And when we did our further spot check in 2018, we found evidence of a lot of innovation in thinking about how to communicate evidence to the public. We were particularly pleased to see that internalisation of a public audience for the policy-making process. We were very excited by that, and particularly just pleased to see that a role for the analytics professions, those people who are normally behind the scenes, sort of suffering a bit on the front line when they want to get their data out from the kind of imperatives of the communications and policy professionals who always about it's the message rather than the thing that sits behind it. So there was a really nice sort of little transfer of power going on there in terms of who was dictating what got published around the policy background. So that was very nice to see. Unfortunately, we have seen a lot of strains on this during the pandemic, where transparency is once again regarded by some as a luxury. And quite quickly, that may seem that way back in April 2020, but quite quickly it became clear that the kind of democratic buy-in that you need to sustain people's trust in the basis of policy is something that's worth investing in. And I think perhaps we've seen something now begin to go back the other way. So I'm very excited to see that there's, really what we're doing here, talking about here, is the start of a global movement, which is something that will benefit both the policy-making process itself and the evidence base for that, and also, I think, our wider democratic debate.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tracy. That really sets the framing up really well for the remainder of this discussion. And I see that Senator Kutcher has joined us now. Welcome, Senator. You missed it, but I did give you a really great introduction. And so, we're diving right in. Tracy's given her opening remarks, but I am going to pass it over to you now and to take us through the rest of the session.
Glitches are they are what they are. I want to thank Evidence for Democracy for putting this on, and to the CSPC for organizing the whole conference. And I just share with you, you'll guess my age when I share this part. This is much more complex than the slide carousel. All right, we are, and I want to thank the people who worked so hard to get this up and running. I caught a little bit of what Tracy was saying, and I would concur with the points that I heard. We all benefit when governments make policy decisions that are informed by best available scientific evidence. And I phrase best available because not all evidence is equal. And that's an issue that we need to keep in the back of our minds. But the reality of the political process is that policy decision-making is very complex. And it takes into account many, many different factors, and scientific evidence is only one of those factors that it takes into account. Now, personally, as someone who spent most of their professional life steeped in bringing best available scientific evidence information to practice, I can certainly share with many who are on this call the frustration when scientific information is sometimes not the principal or even one of the principal factors in political decision making. And I think we've all been there, and we want to try to change that. Now that I'm on the other side of the process, part of my task is to try and nudge decision makers to make greater use of best available science in policymaking, sort of to be a science senator, if there was such a thing. This includes encouraging policymakers to take the time to find out what the best available science says, and to understand that there is a hierarchy of scientific information, and to seek advice from experts that themselves use best available science when they give advice. Now, one of the things that I've learned is that one of the common ways in which parliamentarians get information is through expert, and I'm putting that in quotations, expert witness testimony in committees. We all hear it from expert witnesses. And the information that committees get from the witnesses is considered evidence. Remember that. It's not how a scientist would think about evidence, maybe more like a lawyer might think about evidence, but it's considered evidence. So when a politician is thinking evidence-informed decision-making, they may be thinking, what did the witness tell me? So it really matters who is the expert and what is the nature and quality of the scientific evidence that the expert brings to their testimony. So let me illustrate this using a very extreme example. If policymakers were studying this particular problem and they had an expert witness called Dr. Kerry Medij, this is a real person, and they asked her about information about vaccines, she is a doctor, they would likely hear that vaccines contain, quote, RNA modifying transhuman nanotechnology, end quote. Most of you would realize that just word salad. And that this technology is provided in, quote, liquefied computing systems, end quote. And that it contains something called, quote, Hydra vulgaris, end quote, which is a jellyfish-like organism that can multiply and form independent neural networks that influence people's thinking and behavior. Now, I didn't make this up. This is actually the case. If this was what the parliamentarians heard and they believed it, it would not be surprising that the policymaker would have evidence to oppose vaccinations. Now, so sound, best available scientific evidence delivered by credible experts is essential for making good public health decisions and in all decisions. However, not only should scientific evidence inform policy, but policymakers, in my opinion, should ensure that the scientific evidence that they are using is open for all to see. In a word, transparent. The need for transparency has been starkly displayed, as Tracy said, during the pandemic. If you look around the world, different governments have made different policy decisions, although the evidence base for their decisions may have been exactly the same or largely similar. Those decisions had substantial on-the-ground outcomes, some much more negative than others. So the transparency of the decision-making, I think, is fundamental to a well-functioning civil democracy. So we have much to unravel and great panelists to help unravel this. How is best available scientific evidence used or not used in policymaking? Also to these really, really important questions. So Tracy started off, she introduced herself and gave her bit. So can we go on to the next panelist? I have on the list here Farah, then Ted, and then Frederic. Can we start with that route and take us away, smart people?
Well, there. Hi, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Farah Quaster, and I'm still the slightly new Director of Research and Policy at Evidence for Democracy. In case you haven't heard, our mission at Evidence for Democracy really is to promote the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making. And in recent years here in Canada, we have seen some strides in this space. We've seen, if you check out the past mandate letters, you'll note that the Government of Canada has committed to evidence-based decision-making. But it's really hard to assess what progress has been made in this space without transparency. And whenever we talk about evidence-informed decision-making, we don't focus as much time about the public's ability to find the evidence behind decisions and whether they can assess the evidence that's being used in decision making. And that's really what we're trying to focus on here with our research in this space here at Evidence for Democracy. So earlier in June 2021, my colleague, Dr. Tage here, he laid the foundations for this work. He took the transparency framework that Tracy just described from Sense About Science. Here's a photo in case you like visuals. And he adapted this for the Canadian context. He adapted this framework. So going from things such as diagnosis, proposal, implementation, can we find the evidence behind decisions, and tested it on 7 different policies from federal departments and agencies. And this is the framework that we're using, which in a nutshell, we can use to ask the question, can the public find evidence behind decisions? Now in phase 2 of our work, we're using this framework to carry out a systematic assessment of federal policies from departments and agencies in the Government of Canada. Specifically, I'm evaluating 10 randomly selected policies from 10 different federal departments and agencies. So that's a total of 100 policies, and that is a lot. We're getting to the end of our work, and I can actually share 2 key findings with you all today. The first is that I've noticed that evidence is often hinted at, but it's not clearly stated or cited. So for example, let's say there's a new policy around tobacco usage. You might notice in the beginning that there's a sentence that says, tobacco use is harmful and it poses many dangers. But there's no supporting evidence. I can't see what dangers tobacco use poses. There's no citation for me to follow. And if I'm someone who knows nothing about this issue, I don't have any extra information, any supporting background information that shows to me, what is it that policymakers know about this issue? What is the evidence they considered when deciding what intervention to go about with? So that's one common finding that I've seen across a lot of policies. And the second thing that I've noticed is that there are a lot of different norms across different federal departments and agencies. So if we look at something like Environment and Climate Change Canada, I'll notice that, there are some very detailed supporting regulatory statements, and it makes my scientist heart very happy. I can see it's like, this is the evidence behind this issue. These are the different options they've considered. This is why they're going ahead with this. And that's awesome. But in some other departments and agencies, I've noticed that, policies are very brief. It's hard for me to understand, why is this an issue? Why is this an intervention? Yes, I could Google and figure out and gather that information, but it's not there in the policy announcement. And it's going to be hard for a member of the public to figure out, okay, why and what evidence was used to make this decision. So that's where we're at with Evidence for Democracy's work on transparency. I will pass it to our next speaker, who I believe is Ted.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for having me here today and for organizing this event. So my name is Ted Hsu. I'm here in Kingston. I used to be the Member of Parliament for Kingston and the Islands from 2011 to 2015. And while I was MP, I was the science and technology critic for my party in opposition, and the Liberal Party. And I also, I guess I'll just mention one thing that I did as MP. I revived the fight to restore the long form census. So I'm a big supporter of using what evidence we have, and the best evidence we have to try to make the best policies possible. I'm going to talk a little bit about what barriers I've seen to being informed by evidence and using evidence to make decisions. And I'll start with a quote. It goes like this. It goes, "Don't let the green grass fool you. Don't let the moon get to you. Dance with the one that brought you, and you can't go wrong." That's from Shania Twain. And I bring that up because this phrase, "dance with the one that brought you," is used in politics to talk about something which can be called political capital. And that is the ability to do things because you have supporters who are willing to support what you want to do. And let me illustrate this idea of political capital in a maybe somewhat provocative way. So in Ontario, Premier Doug Ford is often criticized as merely helping out his friends when he does things that the opposition parties don't agree with, and maybe doesn't offer evidence, good enough evidence to support what he wants to do. But maybe he needs to help his friends to get things done, to get conservative things done, because that's what he was elected for. So the issue is that it's very hard to be transparent about political capital, because you can lose all of your political capital if you're too transparent. And so there's this problem that you end up with politicians trying to make up reasons for why they're doing things, when the real reason is they do certain things because they need to dance with the people that brought them, and in order to do things that they think are important, and that they were elected to, that lots and lots of people believe that are important. So I think one of the important barriers to consider when it comes, and I'm not saying this is new, I think all of our previous speakers understand this, is that decisions where political capital is involved, where you need to do something so that you can work on things that are important. That's an important consideration, which you can't really be too transparent about. And I'll give you another example from my own experience. When I was an MP, it was during the time, in the years ago, it used to be that people wanted to ban GMO foods. And then it turned into people wanted to label GMO food. So before that transition, there was a lot of pressure on MPs to take up the cause, to spend time looking at GMO foods and the risks involved. And it was you had to make a decision as to whether you're going to spend time on that, because time is probably the rarest resource that you have as a politician. A decision had to be made about whether you're going to spend time on that or spend time on something that you think had a better probability of doing good things for people. And so it was not so easy to spend, if you wanted to convince people who wanted you to work on banning GMO foods, you had to go through the evidence if you wanted to take the evidence route. And it would have taken a lot of time to sit down and go through the evidence and say, this is not a good return on time spent. And so in the end, you just had to take a shortcut, like saying, okay, well, yeah, we could do some more research. We could look into this and that, and then leave it at that. and not pursue it any further because there were other things that you could do as a politician, other things you could work on, which would give you a better return on benefits to society. So that's a example of where you couldn't really go through and explain everything with evidence. You just had to say, I have some political capital, I have some limited time resources, and I believe that I can do better for people by spending it on something else. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll pass it on to Frederic, who is the next on the list.
Hi, can you hear me? And is there feedback? We're good?
You're good, Frederic. Thank you
All
for
right.
your patience and your work to get on.
This, I feel like an honorary astronaut. This feels more complicated than NASA, but I'm doing all right. So I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I'm Frédéric Bouchard. I'm a professor of philosophy of science and dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Université de Montréal. And I guess my thoughts for today are informed more by philosophy of science, but also my administrative position. And basically, I've looked in my research on how experts are mobilized in policymaking and in democratic societies, and it's very obvious. And this has been studied by sociologists and political scientists, uh, mostly in the United States, but the results are roughly similar in other democratic societies. Is that scientific experts are highly trusted. They're the group that has the most trust and the most robust trust across decades. Where it gets interesting is how people feel about scientists making the decisions. And this is where there's much lower enthusiasm. So most people, and this is pre-COVID, but I don't have a big expectation that COVID and public health attitudes will change much of that, is that people are very comfortable and hope that scientists give advice, but they're not that comfortable when they think that scientists decide instead of government or elected officials. So when we think about transparency, it has to be, we have to think it in two, I'd say on two levels. So it needs to be, it's important that we make clear where the evidence comes from or where the advice comes from. Who are the scientific experts that are called upon? But it's also important to be transparent about who decides. And there, if we look at surveys, but also, it's pretty intuitive, is people want, when I say people, not everyone, not all the time, obviously, but many want the elected officials to make the decisions or the government officials based on scientific advice. But we need to be very clear, and this is where I'd say two-level transparency is. We want to know what the scientists are saying, and we want it clear that the government or elected officials are the one making the decisions based on scientific advice and other aspects and other factors that they may want to consider. So, and this is important also to preserve the trust that scientific experts do have, and that is very high. Because if people feel that there's a mission drift, right, that it's not just advice, but it's decision, then that will hurt the trust that people have in the advice itself. So this is where, and I'm expressing this as a philosopher of science, but also as a dean. So many of my professors are called upon to give advice, and this is a very good thing. And we want this to play this role, in our society. Where it gets trickier is when either elected officials or government officials hint or suggest that the scientists are the ones deciding. And this is where it gets trickier In some sectors, it works, right? Because there's government agencies where the mandate is for the expert advice to do the arbitrage. But in other aspects of society, it's not clear. I mean, that elected officials should be, just handing their responsibility to other bodies, be it scientists or other advice. So we need to think about transparency in a very kind of profound way, if we want the responsibility to play its role at the right decision level. And I guess these would be my opening remarks, but I'm happy to come back to these points later in discussion.
Thank you very much, Frédéric, and thank you to each of the panelists for those cogent and thoughtful opening remarks. Now, I do have a script that all of you have, but I'm going to deviate slightly from it when it comes to certain points, and I hope you forgive me. I've learned to ask for forgiveness, not for permission. So we're going to, though, however, start with parts of the script with Tracy and Farah. We've heard about importance of transparency. Why is it important? And what difference does it make? And why should we care about it?
Well, I think it's just sort of reflecting back on my fellow panelists' comments as well. I think it's actually crucial for the conversation between government and people, and you arguably are missing a really big part of your democratic decision making if you don't have the same access to the facts as the people, for the decisions that affect your lives and shape our lives. And so, ultimately, it's an important part of accountability. I don't see how. I mean, just to put it in a really blunt fashion, I mean, how on earth can you hold a government to account for employment or for the position of women or for anything else if you can't describe it in statistics? And so, how our ability to actually measure the impact of policy depends on us also understanding what the policy was designed to do and what it was based on, what the assumptions were behind it. So I think it's important for that reason, but it's also very important, as I mentioned earlier, for good, sound decision making, that we build upon the knowledge of the past. I mean, our resources are expended in great quantities to find stuff out and monitor things. Justice departments do investigations into the sort of 10-year reviews of the impact of state measures on youth justice. What would we want our governments to throw that away and start all over again, like kind of Groundhog Day over and over again? I mean, there's a really important point there about the investment that we make also as a public in the resources that government has, and that they need to be brought to bear on future decisions as well. So I think the democracy is trumps. I feel in this discussion, but I think also there is a huge benefit for us to know what actually works and what is the state of play, and to ensure that government uses best available.
I'll add 2 points here. So I think in Canada we're a little in danger of evidence-informed decision-making becoming a buzzword. And as I mentioned earlier, without transparency, it's really hard to see the progress that we're making in this space. And now just thinking about the pandemic, we know that transparency is especially important in times of increased uncertainty when, trust is so critical, such as the past few years that we've been living through. And there have been times during the pandemic where the public has really struggled to understand government decisions. It's not clear why a decision was made, and it's been harder because of poor communication. And really, as we're kind of thinking about the next challenges that we have to face, such as tackling climate action and thinking about the potential for future pandemics, the public demand for evidence has kind of never been higher, and transparency is kind of one step forward in this space.
I think that both of you raised really, really important points there. The core aspects of a democratic, well-functioning democratic society is the ability to understand why governments do things. Ted, you've been at that table. Frédéric, you've studied that table. Do you have further thoughts?
Well, let me. I have another quote. I'll put another quote forward just to preface my remarks, and it's the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. That's from Emily Dickinson, and I find that hard decisions are easier if voters learn about evidence, they digest it, they accept it, and they reach their own conclusions. It's a lot easier to get political will to make hard decisions if that's if it happens that way, instead of saying here's the solution and then talking about the evidence. The Washington Post has this quote: "Democracy dies in darkness." But voters are going to recoil if you shine the bright light of evidence in their eyes right away. The problem as a politician is that you're always asked, okay, what are you going to do? Here's the problem. What are you going to do about it? Where's your policy platform? And they want to know what you're going to do. But sometimes you want to do things that are a bit difficult, and you want to start by talking about, well, here are the problems. Here's the nature of the problem. And that's why it's sensible to have this as a solution. You want to talk about it in that order. But a lot of people want to know what you want to do, and then they'll draw their own conclusions about whether you're right or not. And one example which has stuck with me for a long time, which involves a pretty important policy, is around the year 2007, 2008, the opposition Liberal Party proposed the idea of putting a price on greenhouse gas emissions. But the way it was communicated was a mistake, because it was communicated simply as, here, we're going to put a price on greenhouse gas emissions. You can call it a tax if you want. And before, what I think should have been done, which is we should have been telling stories about here's why sustainable energy, conservation, efficiency, renewable energy, here's why it cannot compete with the ability to burn fossil fuels for free without taking into account the social costs of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you had told those stories over and over again, so people said, it's not fair, and that sort of permeated the public mind, I think that the public would have accepted that it would be a good thing to put a price on greenhouse gas emissions to make things fairer, to make the economy work better. But instead, it was communicated as, here's our answer to this greenhouse gas problem. We're going to put a tax, we're going to put a price on greenhouse gas emissions. And immediately, the opponents of this idea characterized it as a tax on everything. That was it. That was the end of the conversation in the public square. So it's really important, I think, to know where the public is and to talk about the evidence. And this is why transparency is important, to put the evidence in front of people. It's a big job because people are busy. People have, there are things that people need to learn. And it just takes time to do that. And I think, the art of politics is to know where people are at, what the state of public knowledge is. And not only that, because if it were just that, you could govern on the basis of opinion polls, but to have a real sense of, if we had a fulsome public discussion about an issue, where after that process could public opinion be? What's possible? Where could public opinion move to? And that tells the politician what is possible and what can be done. And I think that transparency at that level has a big role to play in allowing us to move further than we otherwise could.
This is maybe in the same line. Is transparency is a tool, right? It's a tool to achieve a certain goal, and in this, maybe as an analogy, I trust my parents, right? I know that we may not agree on everything, but that they have my well-being at heart. So the degree of transparency that I need from them is much lower than one that, if I encounter someone for the first time, and we're trying to align our interests and goals. And so in this light, transparency is necessary in part because we're a collection of people that do not know each other, and we're trying to establish and maintain trust. So when you're trying to establish and maintain trust with strangers, you do need higher levels of transparency, because you don't have enough information to guarantee that that your well-being will be taken into consideration with decisions that will be made. And this is important to understand, that there is an issue of trust across society, right? So it's not a question about scientific expertise in particular and how it's involved in policy making, but if you have a very diverse, changing society, in some sense, you have new interactions with novel people and novel communities very often. And so transparency is even more important than if you have a very small static society, right? That's using history as in past shared history as a way of fostering trust. If you have a dynamic society that changes a lot, well, you're going to need a way to create these bonds. And this is why transparency is a very important tool in establishing trust. The examples that Ted was using about stories, that's another tool, right? So communication, stories, it's used sometimes pejoratively in terms of shaping the narrative, but in a way it's shaping what is the shared interest among a people. And so transparency, stories, communication, they're all tools to establish trust. The way they're marshaled in public discourse will depend on the, let's say, background level of trust that people may have. And this will vary within and across communities, and depending on the topic. So you could have high levels of trust on certain topics and lower levels of trust on other topics. And issues where there's lower level of trust, you will need to reestablish the trust. And this is where transparency will most probably be more necessary than on issues where there's a background high level of trust in the first place.
Tracy, you raised your finger. I saw it. You wanted to.
Yeah, I'm really nervous about some of this discussion. I mean, I very much agree with the importance of understanding, and also understanding the difference between, the sort of epistemological trust that we have, where we accept that somebody's done a really good, probably played by the rules to get to the evidence. They're probably saying something truthful. They've done what we should do to find stuff out. And the recommendation trust that we have, where we allow that someone might have our interests at heart or not. Because I think if we look at the fact that we want governments and parliaments who scrutinise them, we want governments and parliaments to do a better job of asking the question about whether or being transparent and using evidence and showing how they've used evidence, then I think if we put the mountain of building public trust in front of that, we're going to struggle. And what I think we need to perhaps set our hat at the moment is respect. That you can think the government really doesn't work in your interests, or doesn't really work for people like you. But you can have some respect for the basis of a policy, like don't use your cell phone while you're driving, because you know that it was based on a proper analysis of the causes of death on the roads last year. So I do think we need to be a little bit careful. What I'm really saying is don't freak out the government employees too much about the road ahead, because I think we can also have a frank discussion. The great thing about transparency is it doesn't mandate a level of evidence, and that's what's really important. Newtonian physics did not account for the universe anywhere near as well as Einstein's, but they were enough to get us to the moon. So sometimes what we need for a decision and to do something even quite brave can be less than perfect evidence or less than perfect science. And I think having a frank discussion about that too is a really healthy thing for us to do as a society.
Yeah, I don't know about the rest of you. I've never seen perfect evidence for perfect science, but and I think that that's one of the myths that's out there, that people expect science to be perfect and don't understand that science changes, and the change in information is part of what science actually is. So I just want to leave that hanging a bit, but I want to continue this, and I'm off script, so don't look at your papers. So I just because I think we've gone to a really, really interesting place. And I'd like to just see if I can poke this place a little bit more, because I think it's really important. In the last decade or so, we have seen a number of countries, and I will not name them, in which there's been a rise in populism. And as part of that rise in populism, there's been a weaponizing, and I'm using that word carefully, it's been a weaponizing of distrust in science. And a weaponizing of distrust in the body of expertise. And that, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about vaccines, whether we're talking about ivermectin or anything else along those lines, it has been weaponized as a political tool and wedge and more. So any thoughts on how transparency can help us deal with this new world that we're living in which there is a weaponizing of distrust? Thoughts?
Maybe I can start on this one. First, we need to keep in mind that I'll say anti-science just as a caricature, but it's very low. So I think what you're pointing at is very real, but we must just keep in mind that it's more limited than we may fear. It doesn't mean we shouldn't take it seriously, but we just need to recognize that, again, people in general have a very high level of trust towards scientific expertise. That being said, it is being, as the word you use, weaponized. And here, I think we need to be careful. And I'll say this, I felt both heartened and worried when I heard elected officials saying, "I trust science." And the word that worried me was "I," as if it were a choice, a personal choice. And then this links to the partisan issue, because in a weird way, you're saying to people, well, it's up to you to decide whether you should trust science or not, and whether your political family sits on your side or not vis-a-vis that belief. So we need to be careful. This gets back to the previous comment, is that we need to be clear that we need scientific advice, and that choices will be made, and the choices will take into account a variety of factors. If we make that clear, then it's harder to weaponize science in terms of a conspiracy theory that the scientists are deciding for instead of the people you have elected. So we need to kind of, I'm not saying it's easy, but we need to be very rigorous in explaining how the decisions are made. Because when we're not being rigorous, when we're either leaving some maybe hesitation, maybe when we're suggesting that the scientists are deciding, when in fact it's either elected officials or government officials of other kinds, then it's making it easier for the adversary, the political adversary, to weaponize, as you mentioned, or to polarize based on scientific advice itself. The other point that you made is that we're focusing a lot on disagreements, whether there are disagreements or not between scientific experts. But we need to remember that oftentimes it's not that they're disagreeing, it's that they're looking at different things. So if one expert is showing the impact of, let's say, a policy on economic development in an area, and another is focusing on, let's say, the climate, the environmental or the public health effects on a given population or community, they're not in disagreements. They're looking at different things. And this is why you need at some point to make it clear that the choice that will be made will take into account a diversity of advice, but they may not be taking into consideration like a debate or, you know, a supposed disagreements between experts, but a diversity of viewpoints on different aspects of the story. And if we are better at showing that, it's hard. I mean, people can instrumentalize any position, but it's making it harder for them to do so when we make it clear that there's not a single, you know, homogeneous advice that leads to a simple decision-making process. And that actually, when we're making the public policy, decisions, there is a diversity of scientific advice, not necessarily adversarial scientific advice. There's just diversity of parts of the puzzle, and that the choices are made taking into account this advice and other stakeholders' interests.
I saw Farah, Tracy, and Ted all wanting to say something, but Farah just got her hand up first. So you go first, Farah.
I'm going to pull a feather out of Ted's hat and actually quote from a piece. There was this
Go for it.
opinion piece in the New York Times called "Science Alone Can't Heal a Sick Society." And I think it's kind of important to keep that in mind. Like, science is only one of the inputs in decision making, and there's so much more to consider. This piece really dove into the fact that, different countries have had different levels of success when it's come to implementing public health guidelines. And it's really the root causes that kind of influence that level of success. So things such as levels of political cohesiveness, social trust, income equality, mis or disinformation, and collectivism. And science isn't immune to any of these factors either. So I would just kind of caution folks who are listening in that these are all root causes that all play a role in distrust. And transparency is kind of just that first step, that tool to help rebuild trust. And we're really going to have to keep an eye on the bigger picture if we're planning to think about how to address the ongoing growing issue of distrust.
Tracy, Ted?
I think there's a couple of things. One is about the pandemic. Just as we're dealing with this and sort of being amongst fellow promoters of evidence and policy, I do think it's beholden now on people in this kind of world to be the first to say that our values can be more important sometimes, or that there are value judgments that are sometimes being made by people who start first with the scientific arguments. So I think we have actually seen quite a number of scientists speak in a way that hasn't been so obvious about their own values. And they're making judgments. They're often making judgments about things without. They just betray a certain world outlook, I think, and we need to be clear about that. The most important thing, though, just keep it really simple with politicians. Present company accepted, perhaps, but testable questions is what we talk about. Most policies have an element of testable questions. If I say Vancouver should host the Olympics because that's a really prestigious thing for the city to do, then that's a value statement and you can't really test it. But if I say Vancouver should host the Olympics because that will get more young people taking up sport and reduce childhood obesity, then that's a testable question. And I think that's what we need to be sort of drawing out, is that policies tend to be made of a mix of value judgments and testable questions. And the whole issue for us is, in terms of accountability around evidence, is where are the testable questions and are you testing them fairly?
Good points. Ted? I'm going to have the last say here before I go to questions.
Well, I just wanted to give my own personal impression. I feel that during the pandemic here in Ontario, it feels like the transparency around data related to the pandemic and the fact that there's so many people on social media processing the data, maybe replotting it in a graphical form, giving regular updates, getting lots of followers on social media. It just seems to me that the information has been propagated and digested and communicated very well by the population as a whole. And it felt like it was a lot easier to make an evidence-informed decision because the public was receptive to it, because so much work had been done by people to look at the data, and I think at the origin, it's the transparency. It's that the data were available, and there were a lot of knowledgeable and competent people to interpret it and then re-communicate it in ways that were accessible to a lot of people. I feel like it was a success, the public health aspects of the pandemic. I think, to contrast, when it came to trade-offs between public health and economic activity, it was a little bit less transparent. And I think there was a lot less agreement as to what the evidence was behind certain decisions. That's just my personal impression, but I just wanted to bring out that contrast.
I think that's a really important point, Ted. And just before I go to questions from the audience, which I'll read the question and I'll ask one person to answer it. It wasn't as spontaneous and holistic and evolving as you have put it out, I don't think. I don't know, many of you may know Professor Tim Caulfield from University of Alberta. He and I catalyzed the development of an organization called Science Up First, whose entire goal was to debunk misinformation and disinformation, and got a huge following of scientists and clinicians and everyday people and to actually do this. So we actually had to work. You have to work really hard at dealing with some of this stuff. But anyhow, here you're going to see my problem here as I read this. Okay, here we go. Are there any countries, and I'm going to ask Tracy for this one, and then Farah, you can join in. Are there any countries that have a model of transparency that Evidence for Democracy or Sense About Science borrow from or think that has promise?
From my side, so just from my side, I found not so much country level, but specific government departments and agencies, where you would find sometimes, because of the tenure of a leadership in that agency for a while, you would find really good innovation and frankness about the nature of evidence. So, for example, one of our least scientifically based departments of work and pensions had these things called little evidence summaries, which I think they largely innovated to share with their colleagues, and then they became part of policy proposals. But they were just so straightforward and really good, and a great example of not burying something in footnotes and thinking it makes it evidence based, and just leveled with people. So we picked out some examples, really. And not just in the UK, but elsewhere too. We picked out some examples. I would say through the pandemic, we've been following this as well. And we've picked out examples by country there, where we were looking at the nature of the conversation between government and the people about about the uncertainties in the evidence. But countries have waxed and waned on this. So the Netherlands was doing incredibly well at the beginning, and then just lost it, really. And started to sort of really resist having that open conversation about uncertainty. I think there's no country that I would point anyone to and just say, go gather your harvest there.
Farah, what are your thoughts?
I mean, Tracy has really led this work and is one of the first to lead this work. So yeah, there aren't a lot of countries who are doing a lot of work in this space. And I'm really glad that Sense About Science developed that first transparency framework, which we were able to adapt for the Canadian context. And we're really looking forward to moving our eyes to the provincial level next. We're focusing a lot on the federal government today, but transparency is just as important at a provincial or municipal level. we also need to think about how evidence is being used in federal, provincial, and municipal decisions. So that's something I'm thinking about next. And, if there are any international folks in the audience, please think about, adapting the transparency framework for your jurisdictions, because we can learn a lot from different practices in our different regions. And I think this is a conversation that's just beginning. I think we're moving from advocating for evidence-based decision making to actually saying, okay, how do we evaluate this? How do we make this happen? And the transparency framework actually looking to see if the public can find evidence behind decisions is kind of that next step. So I'm hopeful that we'll see more progress towards that.
Well, thank you for that, both of you. And Farah, that's a lovely segue to the next question that we have here. And I'm going to ask Ted and Frederic to start off on this, but anyone can jump in after. It says a lot of the discussion has been with respect to how policies are formed and how decisions are made. That's a fair point. Should we demand the same level of transparency in how policies are evaluated? That's a good question. Thoughts? Frederic, you're nodding fast and furious. Can you go first?
I think it's a great question. I'm just trying to think of, I don't have a quick answer, but I think it deserves serious consideration. I would be interested in figuring out what the process would be in assessing these policies. So would they be different experts? Would they be the same experts? So I'm just curious. I think it's a very important question. My intuitions are that they should be assessed as rigorously as well. I'm just curious as to how to implement it. I'm sure it can be done, but I think that would be where the value to the answer would be, is the actual details of the process of the assessment. Because if the scientists are not the ones making the decision, in some sense, they're not being evaluated, right? The policy is being evaluated, the implementation is being evaluated, so they could be called upon. But how would they be assessing it, since their advice would not have been followed 100%? So anyway, I'm rambling, but I think it's a really interesting question, and it deserves very careful consideration, because it's, if we're not interested in the assessment, then in some sense we could have ideally perfect policies, and if we're not interested in implementation, then it's moot.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And Ted, I'm just going to throw you a little twist on top of what we just twisted you from Frederic. I'm going to put the word independent in there. If independent evaluation.
Yeah. So I'm going to rant about something that's bothered me for a while, which I don't quite have the answer to. So you often get these the auditor generals of the on the federal or provincial level. They'll go and they'll evaluate policies in all sorts of broad range of different areas. And what's always bothered me is you never rely on just one person or one group looking at some issue in science. It's a big headache whenever a constituent comes and says, here's something that was just published. What are you going to do about it? It shows that, this one paper shows that we should do A, B, or C. And in science, you're always like, okay, that's an interesting paper. So what do other papers say? And is it what's the rest of the literature say? And is this strong enough to make any conclusions? Because one paper never settles anything all by itself. It's a consensus that builds up over time. So it's always bothered me that the Auditor General reports, they're not peer reviewed. They're immediately become political footballs. And why are they the experts of anything compared to the whole rest of the scientific community? So, and I'm not saying that it's not a comment about the quality of their work. It's a comment about it's not the scientific process that I'm used to relying on to arrive at the truth eventually. And it's always bothered me that it has so much effect on public policy, on the public perception of whether a policy or program is succeeding or not, to what degree it is. And it bothers me that it's that way. So if there were a better process to have independent expert evaluation that resembles the scientific process, which I have some confidence that in the long run works and brings out the truth, I think I would be happier.
Well, at the risk of making Ted happy, I think Tracy has. I think I see you raising your fingers again. Did I catch that correctly?
So I think it would be first of all important to just approach the sort of development of transparency as a good faith conversation with government agencies. So, people don't go into government, they don't go into politics either to mess their country up or to mess up people's lives. And so much of what happens that isn't great is not necessarily because people are trying to do a terrible job, but they sometimes do a less than good job. And when we found a bit of a surprising thing, when we did the spot check, we found that those policies that were really good and clear in testing and evaluation of themselves, so never mind the independent bit, never mind the, whether you can cook the books after the event, but in thinking through how was this policy going to be tested, they were also really good in the diagnosis of the problem. And what we got an inkling of there, which is only conjecture on my part, but it's backed with a fairly clear pattern, is that when policymakers are at the early stage of developing a policy, when they think about how will we judge if this has worked in 2 years' time, they become a lot clearer about what it is that they're actually trying to change and why. Because they don't want to be held to account in 2 years' time for something, for fixing the whole of, literacy in schools, for example, if what they're actually proposing to do is to improve the number of kids that are going on from 16 to 18 in academic settings or something like this. They actually want to be specific about their policy goals because they're thinking about how will we judge in a few years' time whether this has been a success or not. And so those two things actually go hand in hand. I think a failure to set really clear goals for the policy is part of not being very accountable. And I really liked noticing that relationship.
That's really interesting. Farah, please.
It's perhaps a little tangent, but I do want to say that we're focusing on transparency today. We're not actually talking about kind of the quality of evidence. So we're kind of still in that first stage of the conversation. And the second thing that I just want to flag is that there's a lot of incredible work that's going on behind the scenes in the public service in the government of Canada. And as someone really smart pointed out to me last week was that just because we don't see the evidence doesn't mean that we can infer that the evidence isn't there. And I'm not sure what we can do about this. I don't know what the way forward is, but it is kind of important to mind that we are not seeing everything that's happening behind the scenes. So I'm just going to throw that out there.
And you are so absolutely right about that. But on every single level, at the political level, at the analysis level, at the internal small p political level, this is a hugely complex system, and one that has many moving parts. And I think that you all have just done an incredible job, not only in terms of answering some of the questions that we brought to the table, but also in raising other questions that forces us to think even further and to grapple with these issues even more. So what I want to thank you for any good scientific discourse always ends up with more questions than it started with. So I just want to honor that in this panel. I just would like everyone to think for a moment and maybe just give some closing remarks. And I'm going to go the other way on this time, counterclockwise. So Frederic, we're going to start with you, and then Ted, and then Farah, and then Tracy, if that's okay.
The maybe in closing, I'm really happy that the point of good faith is raised. We are talking about trust and common good, and we have to hope and assume that the people we're working with, or that are offering something, are working in good faith, and that disagreements can be reasonable. So when we start from that hypothesis, if you will, or hope or aspiration, then the issue of trust and transparency, in some sense, are the cause and the result of good faith. So when we approach transparency, if we approach it as as some sort of inquiry, or if it's presented as a confrontation, then it attacks the foundation of good faith and trust that is the one we need to have the common good. So I'm very happy that the point of good faith was raised. Let's keep in mind that transparency and trust, should be informed by assuming that the other people that we're interacting with are doing so in good faith. I think that's a terrific point, and I'm glad that it was raised.
You want to add another little thing? This is, speak now or forever hold your peace moment.
Shall I go next?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so just want to add to Frederic's remarks. As a politician, it's people often say you can only do what you can communicate, and so you can only do what you can get voters to understand and believe in and understand and trust. Trust is really important, because you never have time to explain everything to the average voter. People often say, how do we explain this to the voter at the doorstep? Which means in 30 seconds, how can you convince the voter that a certain policy that you're proposing in an election is one that they should vote for? And so you never have enough time to explain everything. And so trust is really important if you want to get political will to get things done. And because we don't have all the trust that we need, transparency is, and I mean not only that the background information, the evidence is available, but that it gets communicated in a way that people who have busy lives and are short on time can see it, encounter it, digest it, and believe it. That transparency is really important in building trust. So I think what we're doing here is increasing the capacity for a democratic government to do things for the people that elect them. And that's why I think it's very important.
Thanks, Ted. Farah?
So I think this panel has raised more questions than answers, but I hope everyone has enjoyed it so far. I guess my closing remarks really just boil down to the fact that I think Canada is capable of more. I think that we've made strides in committing to evidence-based decision making, but we can go further still. And this week, a new slate of federal elected representatives headed to Ottawa, and they've got a lot of priorities to tackle. They've got things such as climate change, antimicrobial resistance, and the potential for future pandemics to keep in mind. And science is really going to help drive the policy responses to these pressing challenges. And for this, we really need both that piece of trust and that transparency to keep going forward. So we're really going to have to think about, can the public see why decisions are being made and what evidence is being used? And what do we do in those cases where, our elected officials, our policy makers can't be as transparent can't share all of their inner workings, how do we still foster trust in those critical times? So lots of questions, and I think there's a lot more work here to be done by everyone who's interested. So it's not just folks in the government, it's not just researchers like me or Tracy Brown. It's really going to take scientists, members of the public, and just anyone who really cares about the decisions that impact their daily lives to really speak up and, flag that we need transparency. And transparency is not the end goal. It's really that moving towards building trust and being able to trust that good faith and that we can trust our decision makers to make decisions that are best for us.
Thank you, Farah. Tracy?
Well, on that last point of Farah's is so important, and I think going from here, it's going to be incredibly important to find every opportunity to stress that evidence matters to people in all walks of life. That the transparency movement is not the sort of secret takeover by science of government. But I mean, for example, in the UK Parliament, we run Evidence Week in the UK Parliament in conjunction with the parliamentary authorities, and that is opened by people from all over the country, from beekeepers to community aid organisations, talking about why evidence it matters to football stand football fans who are asking for stands where they can stand again instead of sitting, and things like this. They're all saying evidence matters to us, and they've got questions about how Parliament and government are using evidence. We have a national audience with our statistical agency, our national statistician, where again people come from all over the country, or they virtually do it at the moment, and they ask questions like, how do you decide your metrics around schools? Why do you say GDP matters? And all this kind of thing. These are people from every walk of life, actually, asking things like, how do you decide land use? How do you decide what level of pollution to tolerate in our beach, and things like this? And it's really important, I think, that we internalize a public in our policy-making worlds and in our political worlds that cares that good attention is paid, that we think that when we go the extra mile to understand and ask the extra questions carefully, that will be appreciated by the public. And I think taking every opportunity to show that has public value, and it isn't just policy advocacy that is pushing for transparency, is a big challenge that we should be addressing. The second final point I wanted to make is we have to get real about this. Economic forecasting, traffic management, the way that cities are built, how we manage diseases, what we do about the environment, these things are being built and planned using data, using complex algorithms, using all kinds of new types of evidence and applications of science, statistics, and evidence in ways that many people commissioning them really struggle to understand, that certainly politicians who question them have to jump in and out of these big issues. We should, as a polity and as a public, be asking, are we really equipped for the next part of the 21st century in terms of the decision-making tools and the policy challenges that we're having to get over? And I think that's also another reason why transparency of evidence is something we should all be caring about, because we really should be thinking about what are the checks and balances and where are the gaps in our understanding for some of the big challenges and decisions that we have. And that's something, as we know, when you try to teach something, that's when you find out you don't understand it. And I think there's a real value for government in transparency for that reason too.
Well, listen, thank you very much for that as well, Tracy. I think that I have the unenviable task of trying to wrap this together, and I just it's impossible to touch on all the incredibly useful, thoughtful, and critical points that have been made. So I'm just going to leave you with a few of my reflections as someone who has spent their life as a scientist, a clinician, public health, and policy, and now in a different setting. I've thought that citizen engagement is essential for a well-functioning democracy. And transparency, in my opinion, in decision-making, transparency and evaluation, and these are complex challenges, are a really important part of welcoming citizens into these complex problems that we're all dealing with. So I think that transparency is really a part of a healthy democracy that welcomes citizen engagement. The second thing that came to mind as I was listening was that we are dealing with incredibly complex problems. Not to say that these problems are any more complex than dealing with the economic collapse of Germany after World War I. You know, we tend to forget history had complex problems too. But our tools are incredibly complex now. And I got to tell you, I have the honor of co-chairing the Senators for Climate Solutions. And I spent a couple of weeks this summer trying to understand climate modeling. And I'm not bad with statistics, but I had a heck of a time. It was beyond my capacity to really understand it. So I had to trust the modelers. And the citizens in our societies, they're faced with the same tasks. So the politicians are faced with these complex problems and complex scientific approaches to them. And again, the issue of trust comes up. So as I've been listening to the group, it occurs to me that the trust really is the thread that holds us together. And we have to trust each other to do anything that we do. It is more difficult in a society that has fractures which are as large as the societies we see now. And it is more difficult, as has been said, in societies which are undergoing transition to a more just society, to a more equitable society. That causes problems. And it makes the issue of trust challenging, but we have to move beyond where we were to a better place. And that's the role of politicians. And that is not an easy role, as Ted has pointed out. And as Frederic has talked about, it's not the scientists that make those decisions, it's the elected representatives. The last thought is I see that transparency is really a tool in helping us build and also maintain. You can build and you have to maintain trust. Our previous Governor General wrote a book, highly recommend to the audience, called Trust. And one point that I will never forget, he said, it takes decades to build trust, but it can leave in a moment. And so maintaining that trust is so important. So I just want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Evidence for Democracy for this really engaging hour and a half, or it seemed like 20 seconds to me. So thank you all, and bon chance, and hopefully à la prochaine.